My wife, Rachel, texted me just after lunch. Just having coffee with a friend. I'll be home later. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But that morning, I had received several photographs from an unknown number. They showed Rachel sitting inside a quiet cafe with Daniel, a man she had repeatedly described as an old coworker. In one photograph, he was holding her hand across the table. In another, they were leaning toward each other like a couple. I stared at her message, then typed one sentence, "Ask him about the photos." Within seconds, the typing bubble appeared. Her first message said, "What photos?" Then another arrived, "Who sent you anything?" Then, "Where are you?" Within 2 minutes, 12 messages appeared one after another. Rachel was panicking. She asked whether I had followed her, whether someone had seen them, and whether I had contacted Daniel. I answered none of those questions. Finally, she wrote, "Please don't do anything until I get home." I replied, "Why? You said you're having coffee with a friend." She stopped responding. I could almost hear the silence on the other side of the phone. For months, I had wondered whether my suspicions were wrong. Now I had my answer. I hadn't been following Rachel. The photographs came from someone who had been watching Daniel. He was involved in another dispute at his workplace, and during the investigation, someone discovered his connection with Rachel. The photographs had been sent to me because the sender believed I deserved to know. I checked the dates carefully. They weren't from one isolated meeting. There were photographs from several different weeks. Rachel and Daniel had met at cafes, hotels, and restaurants. Each time, Rachel had given me a different explanation. Suddenly, every late night and every girls' dinner looked different. I realized the lies had been much bigger than I imagined. That evening, Rachel came home early. She entered the house holding her phone tightly and looked terrified. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. She sat across from me and immediately began crying. "I should have told you," I asked. "Told me what?" She couldn't answer. I placed the photographs on the table. She looked at them and covered her face. "It wasn't supposed to become serious," she whispered. I asked how long it had been happening. "Almost 8 months." I felt my chest tighten. 8 months of secret meetings while I believed we were simply going through a difficult period in our marriage. I asked whether Daniel knew she was married. She nodded. I asked whether his wife knew. She shook her head. Then I asked the question I already knew would hurt. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" Rachel stared at the floor. "I kept thinking I would end it," I replied. "But you never did." She started crying harder. She said Daniel made her feel understood in ways she hadn't felt in years. I told her she could have discussed our problems with me. She answered, "I was afraid you wouldn't understand." I looked at her and said, "So you chose someone else instead of giving your husband the chance to understand?" Rachel tried explaining that nothing physical had happened at first. She said it began with coffee, then messages, then emotional conversations. Eventually, boundaries disappeared. I didn't interrupt her. I wanted her to tell the truth without me having to drag every detail out of her. She admitted they had kissed several times and eventually slept together. Then she said something that surprised me. "I wasn't sure whether I wanted to leave you," I replied. "You didn't have to be sure. You only had to be honest." She lowered her head. "I know." That was the first time she didn't defend herself. The next morning, I contacted my lawyer. I didn't immediately file for divorce because I wanted to understand my options and protect myself financially. Rachel asked whether I was leaving her. I told her I didn't know yet. But I made one thing clear. Daniel would no longer be a secret inside our marriage. She agreed to end contact with him. She also offered to show me the messages between them. I didn't need to read everything. The photographs and her confession were enough. I told her that if we were going to attempt reconciliation, she would have to choose honesty without being forced. She nodded, but I knew rebuilding trust would take a long time. Daniel's wife eventually learned about the affair. I didn't send her the photographs immediately. I first gave Rachel the opportunity to tell Daniel's wife herself. She refused because she was afraid of the consequences. So I gave the evidence to my lawyer, who advised me on the appropriate way to handle the situation. Once the truth came out, Daniel's marriage collapsed too. He tried blaming Rachel, claiming she had pursued him. Rachel refused to accept that. She told me later that hearing him blame her made her realize exactly what kind of man she had trusted. She finally understood that secrecy had protected neither of them. Rachel and I spent months living separately. During that time, she went through counseling and took responsibility for what she had done. I also worked through my anger and disappointment. There were days when I wanted to end everything immediately. Other days, I remembered the years before the betrayal and wondered whether they were worth saving. Eventually, we agreed to meet with a marriage counselor. Rachel never asked me to forget what happened. Instead, she said, "I know you'll remember. I just want to become someone you don't have to fear trusting again." That was the first thing she said that gave me a reason to listen. A year later, our marriage looked completely different. We hadn't magically forgotten the affair. Trust had returned slowly, through hundreds of small choices. Rachel stopped hiding her phone. She became honest about where she was and who she was with. More importantly, she stopped expecting forgiveness simply because she apologized. I told her that one sentence from that afternoon still stayed with me, "Just having coffee with a friend." She smiled sadly and said, "I wish I had just told you the truth." I replied, "So do I." We both knew that one honest sentence might have saved us months of pain. I still remember those 12 panicked messages. "What photos? Who sent them? Where are you? Please don't do anything." At the time, they felt like proof that my marriage was falling apart. But later, I realized they were also the moment the lies finally lost their power. Rachel could no longer control the story because I already knew the truth. The photographs didn't destroy our marriage. They exposed what had already been happening behind my back. And I learned something I'll never forget. When someone tells you a simple story but becomes terrified when you mention the truth, sometimes their panic says more than any confession ever could.